Hello and welcome to the channel. This video is part 2 in a series learning all about operator and FM. In the last video we learned mostly about what FM synthesis actually is, what it sounds like, etc, and we dived in a little bit into operator and how it works, but we mainly just focused in the basics of this sort of oscillator section here on the left. In this video though, we're going to dive straight into absolutely everything you might want to know about operator, every parameter, every modulation, destination, all the routing possibilities, absolutely everything. So we're going to start with explaining some of the basic parameters that you might find in the oscillator section here, and then after that we're going to start making our own pad sound. Hopefully it's going to be really fun. So in the last video we did dip our toes a little bit into this oscillator section here, but let me explain everything that's contained in here in a lot more detail. As you might know, there are 4 separate oscillators and these are all actually exactly the same. So if I change some of the envelope settings here, you can actually see when I go through them, they're separate, but they all function exactly the same. And by using the algorithms, we can tell the synth how to route these oscillators, so which ones are going to be modulators and stuff like that. If you're still unsure about what a modulator is and what a carrier is, go back and watch the last video. I explain absolutely everything there is to know about that. But anyway, moving forward, in the oscillator section, we have 2 main sort of windows, I guess you could call them. So we have the envelope window and the oscillator window. This only changes what's on the top here, and by changing between these 2 windows, we can either edit the envelope in a visual kind of way, or we can edit the oscillator in a visual kind of way, which we'll get into that in a bit. Right now we'll focus on the envelope section. So operator basically has a normal ADSR envelope that you might find in any subtractive synth, except it also has 2 extra options. So we have the initial value here and a peak value. Basically, these are trying to emulate the way that old FM synths handled their amplitude envelopes. So back in the day, on those synths like the DX7 and stuff like that, you would have an attack value, which is like a measurement in time, right? But you'd also have an attack level, and that's what this peak value is here. So we're just changing the like where the attack stage is starting on a dB sort of basis. And then we also have an initial value here, which is basically a stage before that has even happened. So with this, we can tell the synth that the waveform is just going to start at max amplitude all the time. So usually you'll get like more of a clicky sort of sound doing that. But these 2 values, they just add a little bit more flexibility in terms of the shape you can make with the envelope here. If in doubt, just fiddle with the visual envelope editor. That's probably the best way to do it. Now in the envelope section, we also have a loop option. So this will loop our envelope, and we have a few different ways that we can actually go about looping the envelope. So we have no loop, obviously, and then we have loop. What this does is it will loop the whole envelope, so everything from attack to release, and then it will wait 100 milliseconds in this example, and then it will loop the whole envelope again. So if we make a sort of more extreme envelope here, and I hold down a note, you'll hear it loops. But it's playing the whole envelope, then waiting 100 milliseconds, and then playing it again. So if I bring this down, it'll get slightly faster. And now if I actually bring the decay down, it will get a lot faster. So that's how that works. We also have a beat loop option. This just syncs the loop rate to your project's tempo. It's pretty straightforward. And we also have sync, which is basically the same as beat mode. There's a subtle difference though, and that is that sync is perfectly always quantized to your project. Like if the transport's moving, it will perfectly quantize the 16th notes or whatever they are to your actual song. So that's all that is. Then we have trigger, and what trigger does is it's basically like a one-shot mode. So if I bring that decay up here, Maybe I'll make a decay of like 3 seconds. If I play a note here and just tap the keyboard like really fast, it still plays the whole entirety of the envelope regardless of how long I'm holding the note down. So in contrast, if I go back to no loop and then I just tap the keyboard again, it's a lot shorter basically. So it's basically like a one-shot mode, so that'd be great for making drums or whatever. Now on the middle here, in this middle section, we have some convenient sort of velocity and note value routing options. So with this top one, we can route the velocity and make it affect the length of the envelope here. So if we brought this to 100%, softer notes would have a longer envelope time and harder notes would have a shorter envelope time. That's a soft note, and if I play the exact same note harder, it's shorter. And we can invert that, so if we wanted the opposite thing, we can go into negative values here. So negative 100. Then we have velocity, that's just simple velocity, so velocity is affecting the amplitude or volume of the oscillator. So soft, really quiet, can barely hear it. Harder. Pretty straightforward. Then we have key. So key is just note tracked amplitude. So lower notes would be quieter, higher notes would be louder. So if I just play up the keyboard, so that's what that does. Now you might be thinking, why would I want to do some of this stuff? Well, with FM, especially if you're trying to recreate realistic instruments, if you think about like a guitar or something like that, lower notes generally, like, they have a slightly different sort of timbre to higher notes. So if you're trying to recreate that sort of thing, you could dial in this value and it would sound slightly more realistic. So maybe if you've dialed in a sound and down in the bottom register it sounds perfect for like an acoustic guitar kind of sound, but then you start playing higher notes and it sounds super harsh and brittle and stuff, that's when you'd want to come in here and just tune this key value. Now the other thing we can do with the envelopes is actually, if you right click up here, you get a bunch of really cool convenient options here. So we can copy envelopes to all the different oscillators here, or we can also copy everything to different oscillators. So if I like put this on course 5 or something and made a really, weird, so something like this, I could go to oscillator D, right click and go copy from oscillator A, and then we have the same exact thing happening. Or for example, we want the same envelope for oscillator D, but we don't necessarily want the same settings everywhere. We can only copy the envelope from oscillator A, and then we're free to do whatever we want. But you'll see how all that works in a sec here once we start making our sound. And we can also copy to all the other oscillators, and we can set the envelope values to max, to the medium, and to low. So you can save on a few clicks basically if you're trying to do an envelope like this or something, or if you've got something else in mind. Okay, that's all the envelope stuff, but what about the oscillator stuff? So if we click on the oscillator here, we get a whole new window, and this is where stuff gets really crazy. So you can see all these weird lines, and when we hover over this window, we get this new pencil tool. And if we start clicking, we're drawing new lines. And what these lines are extra harmonics. So we're actually drawing in the harmonics. And to be specific, what they really are extra sine wave oscillators. Because all harmonics are, or partials are, in reality are just sine waves. So by adding extra sine wave oscillators and actually tuning them perfectly to the harmonic series like this, we have an immense amount of control over our sound like this. So this is basically what additive synthesis is, if you've ever heard of that. The reason Operator isn't really considered an additive synth though is because we don't have full control over the envelopes of all of these harmonics separately, which is generally something a proper additive synth would have. So this is kind of more like a hybrid sort of thing, right? It's mainly an FM synth, and you can control the harmonics on top of that, but you don't have full control over all the harmonics, if that makes sense. But we can get really crazy in here, right? We can just draw anything we want, and you can actually see down here it has a representation of our actual waveform as we draw it, which is really, really neat. If I bring the envelope back up. If you know what you're doing, you can like approximate your own sort of saw waves or square waves too. So if I try to perfect this sort of approximated saw wave. It's basically a saw wave. But the other thing we can do here is actually right click and choose even or odd. So if we choose even, we're going to be only drawing even harmonics, like that. Or if we choose odd, we're going to be only drawing odd harmonics. So if I initialize all these here and click odd, we can try to approximate our own square wave. Kind of like a square wave, I guess. But also we have control of the amount of harmonics that we're actually using, so we can bring it down to 32 or 16. So this is just handy, right? If you're drawing a simpler shape and you only need 16, just make it easier on yourself and choose 16 here, and you've got more sort of room to work here. It's a little bit easier, and it's going to save a little bit of CPU power. But also we can actually go into the oscillator section here and choose from preset wave shapes. So these are all pre-drawn and worked out waveforms here. So we can click sine if we just want to go back to a sine, or we can choose saw wave. See, it's a saw wave, and square wave, triangle. We also have the option to use these sort of lower resolution versions of waveforms. So we have like saw 8. So that's just relating to the amount of harmonics. So there's 8 harmonics in that saw wave. So the rest are pretty explanatory there. So like we have this 16 harmonic square here. Then we also have some noise oscillators, which are actually really handy, which we might get into in the next video, but just a quick explanation. We have 2 different noise oscillators. One is called noise looped, and this is just looping the same sort of sample of noise over and over again. So if you play a note, sounds like noise, but you can actually go up and down the keyboard and it will change pitch, I guess you could call it. Since it's the same sample looped over and over again, it still has sort of a weird tonal characteristic. But if you choose noise white, this is just proper, straight, completely random noise, and it sounds a bit more brighter and fuller. And if you play it all over the keyboard, it sounds exactly the same no matter where you're playing. So those are a bunch of different notes, but they all sounded the same. And then we just have a user wave, and this is just when you want to create your own custom wave. And if you're on one of these preset waves and you start editing it, it will just snap to user mode. So if we keep moving down here, you can see another option, and that is the repeat option. And what this does is it takes our harmonic sort of shape we've made here, so this sort of layout of harmonics, and then it will repeat those sort of ratios of harmonics, I guess you could call it, further up the frequency spectrum. So like past the 64th harmonic, it will like take this exact sort of layout of harmonics again and then just place them in line with the harmonic series basically. So if I play a note, you can see if I just draw like a better shape to illustrate this though, so maybe like something like this. And if I play it lower down on the keyboard, actually, like that. If I add some repeat, you can see it's taking this shape, and you can kind of see it here. It's taking that exact same shape and just playing it again and again and again. But each time it's playing it, it's getting a bit smaller on the spectrum analyzer here, because this is a logarithmic view. But if I change the spectrum to linear view, you can see that same exact pattern just repeated and repeated. And if I turn this off again, we just get the single one. Now, what the sort of numbers on the repeat section mean, as far as I know, what it's referring to is the amount of sort of amplitude attenuation it's going to apply. So like a quarter would be for every repeated set of harmonics, like chunk of harmonics, it's going to turn the volume down by a quarter. And then this one is going to be turning the volume down by half every time, and so on. So the higher value you set, it will basically attenuate the volume of the higher chunks of harmonics more and more. So the higher the value, the more sort of a rolled off or a darker sound you'll get. So if I just go through them all here. Something like that. So maybe not cutting the dB by half or whatever, but like you get the idea. Right, the next thing to talk about here though is the feedback value, and you'll notice it's actually grayed out here, and that's because you can only use this if the oscillator that you are editing is not being modulated by any other oscillator. So in this example, if you can look at it and figure it out, the only oscillator we could use feedback on in this example is oscillator D, because it's right up the top and it's not getting modulated by anything. It's the one starting the modulation chain. So if we go to oscillator D, you'll see feedback will be enabled again. Yep, we can use feedback on oscillator D. But to illustrate this a bit better, I'm going to go to my algorithms and change it to this first one. So now we should have feedback on every single oscillator. So yep, you can see on oscillator A, we have access to feedback again. Same with all four of them. So all feedback is, it's actually pretty simple. If you've ever seen an FM synthesis diagram, you know, similar to these are actually diagrams for FM synthesis. If you Google them, you'll actually notice that some of them are a bit different. Like some of them have little feedback loops around. So around some of these squares, it'll have like another sort of arrow thing going around it. And that's just indicating a feedback loop. So what the feedback loop is it's sending this oscillator back into itself as an FM modulation source. So it's FMing itself. So if we take this back just to a normal sine wave and then bring the feedback up, we'll start getting more harmonics. I put that back on logarithmic. So it's almost like a saw wave sound, which is pretty handy. Moving on, we also have phase. Now, what the phase is doing, all it does is moves the phase offset of our waveform forward and backwards. So if I play a note here and start messing with it, there's not really that much of a difference other than the amount of click we get at the start, because, you know, sometimes we're starting at a 0 point, so we're going to get no click. And sometimes if we like bring it to there, it's going to be starting at max amplitude, so we're going to get like a real harsh click. But generally, you'll only really notice a big difference with this phase offset thing in a few different scenarios. The main one with operator is if you have an oscillator that's already doing a lot of FM or being FM'd a lot. By changing the phase offset, you can actually change the sort of the tone quite a bit. So, for example, if we go back to our first algorithm here and just max all these out and do some crazy FM. You can hear just by changing the phase slightly of one of our oscillators, we get subtly different tones. We can do that on all of them. And so obviously values of 0 and 100 are basically identical because we're offsetting the phase back to its starting position. So you'll generally hear most of a difference around 50%. That's where we're changing the phase. So we're like inverting the phase, or actually as well in between that. So like 33% or whatever it is in between that. So like 70. So that's what that does. And this little R next to the phase is just re-triggering the phase every time you play a note. So when you actually have this off, it's going to function almost more like a modular synth, where it's more of a free-running oscillator. So every time you play a note, the phase is actually going to be a bit different. So if you have some insane like FM happening and you want every note to sound slightly different, you could turn the re-trigger of the phase off and it will actually give you a slightly different tone every time, which is kind of interesting. Now, the other situation where you might actually want to mess with the phase that's not to do with FM is more to do with when you have two signals or two oscillators that are sounding kind of similar. So maybe you have two saw waves like this, one saw wave on oscillator A and one on B. By changing the phase of one of the oscillators here, you're going to start introducing some comb filtering or like phase cancellation of certain frequencies. So maybe if you're making a respace or something like that, that might be a cool idea to sort of play around with the phase. Or maybe opposite to that, maybe you're hearing some weird comb filtering or phase cancellation that you don't like the sound of. Maybe going into the oscillators and changing the phase offset might actually fix that for you. And the last little thing in this oscillator section is this osc to vel thing. So this is basically routing the velocity value to the oscillator's frequency. So if we bring this up all the way, you'll hear that when I play soft notes, it'll be playing one coarse value here. And if I play a harder note, it will jump up to another coarse value. So these are all the same note, I'm just playing a different velocity. And if we bring this Q option off here, this is going to stop snapping to these coarse values, and we'll just get random pitches all the time. So that's all the same note. So that might be an interesting way to generate some interesting melodies. I don't know. But it could also be really useful for FM stuff too. So if you change the pitch of one of the modulating oscillators, depending on the velocity, that could be really interesting as well. All right, that's pretty much all there is to know in the oscillator section here. And yes, my shirt and the lighting just changed. That's because it's the next day. The lighting was getting a bit crappy, so I stopped filming. All right, so now why don't we start actually using the synth practically and make maybe a pad or something. A pad might be a good idea because it's going to allow us to use most of the parameters within the synth, and we just have way more sort of creative possibilities with the pad. We can pretty much do anything we want. Okay, so I kind of already know what I want to do with this pad in a way, so I'm going to go to the algorithm section here, and I'm going to choose an algorithm that kind of fits with what I have in my head at the moment. And so I'm going to pick this one. The reason I've picked this one is this algorithm is going to allow us to have sort of one complex chain of FM happening on the right hand side here, but we also have oscillator A, which is going to be on its own little section, and we can do whatever we want with that without it affecting the other oscillators, if that makes sense. So I'm going to focus on our sort of FM chain in the beginning here. So I'm going to turn down oscillator A and maybe just disable it for now, and then start tweaking oscillator B because that is going to be our carrier, right? I'm just going to start by going to the envelope window here and then just try to dial in a sort of pad-ish envelope shape. So I'll just turn this up a bit. Maybe like 3 seconds of attack. Nice long attack for a pad. It's milliseconds. Maybe something similar for the decay. And then similar for the release as well. Just keep it basic. And bring the sustain down slightly. That sounds alright for a starting point, I guess. But now I'm going to hop into Oscillator C and then start tweaking the sort of FM portion of the sound here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the envelope section and copy envelope from Oscillator B so that I can see what I'm working with here in terms of what's in Oscillator B and how that's relating when I'm editing this envelope. So I'm just going to bring this level up. And maybe bring the course up to 3-ish. Maybe I'll offset the attack a bit by just dragging it out ever so slightly, and same with the decay maybe, and then I'll leave the release the same here. That sounds alright. Now I'm going to do the same sort of idea with Oscillator D. Right click, copy envelope from, maybe I'll do Oscillator C this time. Bring the level up. Maybe I'll make this course value even higher, maybe like 8. So this is going to give us more sort of odd harmonics here. Maybe I'll even offset the attack even more here, and the decay. Now with the release, with your FM oscillators, I generally, as a starting point anyway, keep the release the same throughout all of them, or actually max them out as well. That way, if you keep them all the same, you don't get any weird sort of jumps in harmonic content when you let go of the key. Or if you max them out, same sort of story, except it just stays even more static instead of sort of dulling out at the end, if that makes sense. So if I bring this to max. It's fine as well. Bring this one to max too. But for comparison, if I bring the release of this one all the way down, it's going to sound a bit weird when I let go of the key. Yeah, so that's probably something you kind of want to avoid for a pad anyway. So I'll just bring that back. Now I might actually play around with the fine tuning of maybe Oscillator D here. So that beating sort of effect sounded pretty neat. Maybe we can hop into the pitch shell here, which I haven't talked about yet, and modulate that automatically. That would be a pretty cool idea, I think. So you can see here in the pitch shell, we have an envelope, just like all the other shells do, except this one is a little bit different. It's specifically tailored towards frequency and pitch and stuff. So here you can see on our initial and peak values, we actually have semitones, same with the sustain and end. So assuming you have everything at 100% here and you want to bend up to a specific note, for example, say for example you want to bend up to a perfect fifth or something, all you'd have to do with that is just like type in 7 semitones like that, and then it'll like bend up or down from a perfect fifth. But anyway, that's not really what we're trying to achieve here. And you can also see that the pitch shell here automatically routes to the frequency of every oscillator. So if I just exaggerate everything here, you'll start to hear what's actually happening. So pretty crazy stuff here. I'm just going to type in 0 semitones here for the initial pitch, so nothing weird is happening. And then just tweak it from there. At the moment, I'm just trying to get the general shape of the modulation. I'm not trying to tweak the amount. So it's going to be way over the top here for a little bit, but I'm just trying to dial in the sort of shape of the modulation here. And I'm going to disable all of these oscillators apart from D, because that's what we want here. And you can actually change the sort of curve as well. And when you do that, these new values pop up down the bottom here. So that's the slope of the attack and the slope of the decay and the release, etc. And you can go between those two things by clicking this little grey diamond here. Now I think I might want more of a fast change at the start and then more of a slow slope down, possibly. And maybe I'll make the attack about 3 seconds, just like our oscillator B. And you can see if we let go of the key too early before the envelope's finished, it's skipping to this release phase. And our release is actually 50 milliseconds. So that's why it's sort of jumping down real fast there. But if we instead just increase our release to max, we'll get less of that effect. Now I'm going to dial in the amount I want because I'm pretty happy with that shape. And we can do that with the global pitch envelope amount here. And we actually want a really, really small amount, so I'm going to go way down here. Now, it's pretty hard to dial in at the moment because we want such a small value, but we can actually tweak it further here with our destination A amount. So that's another sort of layer of tweaking you can do. Slightly less than that, maybe like 10. That sounds alright to me. Now I'm going to talk about these other two options here on the pitch shell. This first one is called spread. What this does is it every time you play a note, it's going to split the synth into two separate voices, and it's going to detune those two voices, so you get some nice natural sort of width happening. Yeah, that's a lot nicer for a pad, I think, to spread up. And this transpose option here, obviously it just transposes the whole synth up or down a semitone. So that might be useful maybe if you're making drums or something like that, or also maybe if you've designed a sound from scratch but you've been playing in a really low register the whole time, and maybe you want to bring it down an octave or up an octave or whatever, just so people can have an easier time playing it on their actual keyboard. And you'll also notice in the pitch shell here we have a loop option, just like all the other envelopes do in the synth, so we get the same options there, which is really neat. And we also have this end value. So all the end is it's a value that's attached to the release. It says when the release is happening, I'm going to jump up to this value. For example, maybe by the end of the release phase, we want it to go up an octave, so 12 semitones there, just as an example. But yeah, and we also have destination B here, and we can actually route this to all of the different modulation destinations in Operator here. So we have a bunch of them. We have the individual volumes for the oscillators, so that's actually like a second separate envelope that we can use for each oscillator that's actually separate from the envelopes we get here, which is pretty neat. Then we have crossfade options. So all that will do is sort of, when the modulation is at the low point in this example here, it'll be fully on oscillator A, and then as the modulation goes up to the max value, it will slowly crossfade to oscillator C there, which is actually a pretty neat sort of option for cool sound design possibilities, I guess. And you have just the usual other destinations like the feedback, like we talked about, the oscillator's frequency there. What FM drive here is it's kind of like a master amount for like the FM amounts. So like if we were to modulate the FM drive in this sort of shape, all of these levels on the modulating oscillators would go up a bit and then come back down. Then we have filter modulation options here, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a sec. Same with the shaper, we'll talk about that in a sec too. And we have LFO options as well as volume, panning, tone, which I haven't talked about yet. But what tone is down here on the global shell, all that does is it basically brightens up the synth a little bit, or like darkens it down. So if you ever make a sound that you really like the sound of, but it's just getting a little bit too harsh on the top end, you can roll down the tone here a bit. Maybe I'll bring the tone up to max for now, and then tweak it later. Then we also have time. So this is this parameter in the global shell. What time is it's basically like a master slider for all of the envelopes within operator. So if you bring the time up, that's going to tweak every single value on every single envelope up by 42% in this example. So for example, if you're making a pad like this and you like the way everything's working, but you just want to like sort of maybe drag out the attack and everything and release and decay out a bit more because everything's happening a little bit fast, then we could, instead of going into every single envelope separately, we could just bring up like the time by like 20% or whatever, which is actually really handy. So those are all our modulation destinations, and they're all the same no matter where you're sort of modulating from and to. Now we also have the glide options. So this is where you enable portamento in operator. So if you're making an 808 or something like that, and you want the notes to slide in and out of each other, this is where you enable that, and the time is just how long it takes to slide between notes. Now we've got the pitch modulation sorted, and I've explained it all, so let's head back to our oscillators and see if we can make the sound a little bit more interesting. Maybe I can play around with the actual oscillator waveform editor here and add some more sine waves. Oh, that's getting a little bit more sort of distorted sounding, which is nice, but it's still kind of clean. So if we add more and more up the top here, it's going to start sounding a bit more bit crush kind of, which may be something you want, or maybe it's not something you want. We'll just keep it like this for now. And maybe since oscillator D isn't being modulated by any other oscillator, since it's at the top of our chain here, we have access to the feedback. So what happens if we tweak that? Just gets a little bit more gritty, which is actually pretty nice. How does that sound all throughout the keyboard here? So if I play low notes, we go even lower here. And high notes. Okay, so it's getting pretty harsh on the low end here, so maybe we can go in and tweak our key value here like I talked about earlier. Maybe if we tweak that on our modulating oscillators, oscillator D and C, we can sort of tame that out a bit. So if I bring this down into the negative values, it's going to make the top end a bit darker. Especially if we do that in oscillator C as well. Be like 80% on this one. It sounds a little bit better, but bear in mind that whenever you affect the top end with this value, you affect the bottom end. It's kind of like a seesaw, right? We need to go back down the keyboard and see how that sounds now, and we kind of need to keep tweaking until both extremes sound good. So yeah, down low, it's getting a bit extreme here. So maybe we can bring this up to maybe 80% on this one and 70% here. And we can sort of compensate for everything by bringing the level of C down slightly and also D down slightly. How does this sound? Tiny bit better, maybe 75. 65. Bring this down again. It's a bit better now. Let's go back up. Yeah, I think this sounds a lot better in both registers, so that's exactly what we want. Now we can start thinking about Oscillator A down here, which is all alone. So let's bring him into the party now. And I'm just going to find a sort of coarse value that's not too dissonant with everything else. Bring it down slightly. Yeah, 10 sounds pretty nice. Maybe what we can do with this though is totally change up the envelope shape. So maybe I'll do something crazy like and if I loop that now, bring the time down and the release down. So it's coming in instantly when we push a note down. So if we just bring the level down until it's not too distracting, but also so that when we have the rest of the harmonic information coming through, it's not sort of getting buried. Maybe there's a balancing point. I think that's okay. It is getting buried a little bit when everything comes in, but that's all right. Now, what I have in my head though is not really this static rhythm, but more of like a randomized sort of coming in and out sort of thing. So maybe if we modulate this time value here, that sort of thing, maybe bring the decay down slightly. So this is probably the fastest we want it. The problem with modulating the time value here, so I'm just like sort of dragging it with my mouse now. We can't really modulate it properly though, because loop time sadly is not a modulation destination within Operator. Maybe instead of thinking about Operator as our synth, maybe we can start thinking about Ableton as our synth. And if we do that, we have access to everything within Ableton. So I'm just going to type in LFO here and then map this external LFO to the loop time. And then maybe put it on random. And then tweak the rate, depth, and offset until it's sounding all right. Maybe if I bring the smooth all the way up, it's going to sound a bit more random. so on the really high notes, it's a bit distracting and gross. So I'm going to bring this key parameter all the way down. That's also a little bit too much there, so I'll bring the level down slightly. Okay, that's right for now. I don't think we'll be playing any notes quite that high. Let's head into the filter section now, and I can teach you a bit about this. So the filter section, basically we have 5 different filter types. We have a low pass, a high pass, a band pass, a notch, and this funny looking one down the bottom is a morph filter. For example, with the low pass, we can change the frequency cutoff and the resonance. And we can actually get a visual representation of that if we change our little window type here. So this is the envelope window, and this is the filter window. So we can actually see what we're doing here in the filter window. And you can see if I change to high pass, band pass, and notch. And for all of these filter types as well, we have 2 different slopes. So we have 12 dB per octave slopes and 24 dB per octave slopes. What that means is it's basically just the steepness of the slope down at the end here. So if I change from 24 to 12, it's going to get less steep. And we're going to retain more high end here. Now we can actually modulate this filter cutoff with the envelope section in the filter shell too. So I click on envelope and then actually bring the envelope amount up. So you actually need to bring this up for the envelope to do anything. And then start playing, you'll hear it. So that's going from high to low here. And I can reverse that if I bring this envelope amount to negative values. It's going to go from low to high. And we have the usual loop options here too. But in the filter section, we also have this extra section here, which is the shaper. So this is kind of like a distortion. So it's going to be soft clipping, hard clipping, soft sine wave sort of wave shaping here. And we can actually drive into this shaper too. So and we can go into negative values even for that. And we also have this like sort of bit crushing effect here too. So I'm going to turn that off just for now at least. Then we also have some velocity and note value routings here too. So we have the frequency cutoff dependent on velocity. And then we also have frequency cutoff dependent on key value. Now, this bottom one is actually pretty useful. So if you have this at 100%, this is going to effectively key track the filter. So for example, if you're making a saw pluck or something and you're designing it in the low end and it sounds perfect, but then you go into the high end and then the filter's like way too low for the high notes. If you bring this frequency to key option up to 100% here and then tweak it in the low end, it's going to key track that filter and make it the same throughout the whole keyboard relative to the note you're playing, which is really useful. So I usually actually have this at 100% by default. And I forgot to mention, we also have a dry wet option here for the shaper. So we can actually do some sort of parallel distortion type stuff here. So if you like the sound of the distortion, but it's just crushing the dynamics a little bit too much, you can bring this dry wet down a bit and get some more parallel sort of stuff happening. All right, so that's the filter stuff explained here. So maybe I'll just start playing around and maybe we could actually use the morphing filter for this sound. The morphing filter is pretty cool for pads because you can actually generate a lot of weird sort of unique movement with it, which is pretty much exactly what we want for a pad, right? So if I go to morphing here, you can see when we click on the morphing filter, we get an extra option here on the left. This is the morphing value. So if I increase this, it's going to slowly change from a low pass here to a band pass to a high pass to a notch to a low pass again, which is pretty cool. Also, by the way, underneath our little filter type selection, we have this second drop down, which is, if I actually go back to low pass, we get more options here. So we have OSR, MS2, SMP, PRD. Don't really worry about what those stand for. These are all basically just different emulations of analog filter circuits, as far as I'm aware. So if you actually select these, you get a filter drive option here, which is a second layer of sort of driving into the sort of emulated circuit, I guess. So you can actually generate some more distortion that way too. And these filters are actually sort of a little bit more non-linear. So you're just going to get a slightly more sort of analog kind of sound with these. But let's head back to our morphing filter. So with the morphing filter, you can choose an OSR circuit. Unfortunately, I don't think you can change the filter drive amount for this. I think it's just at a set amount, possibly. This can actually also be a good way to crush the sound slightly. Say, for example, if you're boosting the resonance a lot in your filter shape and it's just getting way too harsh, if you chuck it on one of these analog circuits, it can tend to sort of just crush that sort of peak resonance a little bit and generate more harmonics instead, which can be really useful. So maybe for this sound, we'll chuck it on OSR mode. See if I boost the resonance. As opposed to if I take it, whoa! As opposed to if I take it off OSR mode, it's going to sound a bit more harsh. Especially in these low sort of areas. So just something to keep in mind there. So anyway, what we want to do here with the morphing filter is modulate it over time, so we get all these weird sort of shapes happening automatically. So we're going to do that by heading into the last section that we haven't talked about yet, which is the LFO section. So if I go in here and enable this, you can see we also get an envelope here too. What this envelope controls is the amount of LFO modulation happening. So for example, if we dial in like a vibrato sound, it's at max the whole time here. But if I bring the attack up, that sort of wiggly vibrato sound is going to start being unnoticeable, and then it's slowly going to increase over time. If I bring it up to like 7 seconds. So yeah. And as you can see, if I bring the amount up more and bring the rate down a bit, we can change the shape of this modulation. So right now it's sine wave, but we can change it to square. Or we can change it to triangle. So it's pretty similar to sine. And then we have saw up, saw down, and sample and hold. This one's actually really cool. What this one does is it randomly selects a value every time this rate comes around. So basically if I play a note, you can hear what it's doing. If I bring the amount up, there's going to be more possible values basically for it. Bring the amount down, it's going to be like sort of really constrained. And yeah, and we also have a noise option. Now, if you bring this down below around 100 Hertz, nothing really makes a difference in terms of the rate. Everything's kind of the same, but as I said, above 100 Hertz, you can get a little bit of variance in the sound here. Then we also have this drop down here. Now, this drop down is kind of crazy. We have 3 different options. We have low, high, and sync. All sync does is just syncs the rate to the project's BPM as usual. But high is really cool because it turns the LFO into an oscillator. So it's basically the same as an LFO, except we can tweak it all the way up through to audio rates. So as far as I'm aware, if we click on this, instead of this being 107 Hertz now, it's going to be like 1007 Hertz. I think it just times it by 10 or whatever. Or maybe even more than that, I'm not sure. If we put it back on sine. So that's obviously really, really cool. So we actually have a 5th oscillator pretty much here. The unfortunate thing is you can't really tune this to coarse values, so you kind of just have to airball it. But if you imagine, we can actually have like a 5th oscillator in these algorithms if we want, and it's up to you how do you route those. So we can actually route this LFO to any of the oscillators. So essentially, we can have a 5th sort of oscillator on this diagram here, and it's just up to you how you want that diagram to look in your head, I guess. And this re-trigger option here, this little R, that just re-triggers the phase of the LFO every time you play a note. So if you want it to be more free running, so if you're wanting to generate some weird sort of random movement every time you play a note, then you'd probably want to turn this re-trigger off. So if I put this back on L, because we're not going to be delving into the audio rate stuff in this LFO at the moment, and I'm actually going to disable all of these here. And you can see that we have destination A and destination B, similar to what we had in the pitch shell. And destination A is a bunch of preset ones, so these are just all of the oscillators here. And then we also have the filter cutoff, which is what this fill one is. And then if we click on destination B, we have all the usual routing options. So I might actually move the filter cutoff slightly. Let's see how that sounds. Bring the amount way down here. Bring the rate down. Now I'm going to go into destination B, and you'll notice that filter morph actually is a modulation destination here, which is perfect. That's what we want. Now, how does this sound when I start modulating that? It's pretty cool. Maybe just bring the amount down slightly. It's probably a bit too much. I think it's pretty good for a pad maybe, but maybe just bring the rate down slightly. You'll notice we're getting that same sort of problem with when we let go of a note, we get some weird sort of increase in harmonics, and that's due to this envelope here that we've set. So if we just actually bring the release all the way up here, or the end or whatever it was called, and then max out the attack as well, we should get stable sort of non-moving filter shapes. We let go. Yep, that's pretty good. You'll see also underneath this LFO section here too, we have some more routing options. So we have note value dependent rate options. So higher up on the keyboard, maybe it gets faster, and lower on the keyboard, maybe it gets slower. Maybe we can actually do that for the sound, see how that sounds if we bring that to 100%. We go back down to the bottom. Maybe 100% is a bit too much. Maybe we'll just put it on like 40% or something like that. Now this high note is sounding a bit disgusting, right? If we bring the tone down a bit. Maybe to like 60%. It will attenuate that harshness a tiny little bit here. Cool, that's sounding alright. And we also have this velocity dependent LFO amount. So depending on the velocity, this amount parameter will either go up or down. Probably won't mess with that in this sound, but it is an option there if you want to use that. Now, let's move on to the global shell. So if we actually click on the global shell, we have our algorithms up the top here. We have a bunch of different options here too, and we have some options down the bottom here. So what these options in the middle here are, it's almost like our sort of modulation matrix. So if you've ever used like Serum or anything like that, where it has a big matrix of modulation, and you can sort of route different modulations within the matrix. This is basically how that works. So we have here, we got velocity routing. So with this, we can route the velocity value to anything we want. So like, for example, velocity dependent feedback, velocity dependent FM drive, velocity dependent filter cutoff, velocity dependent LFO rate, all of these different options, even tone, which could be interesting, and pan. So we have the same options for all of these different parameters here. So we got key, so note value dependent, whatever you set it to, and aftertouch, which is pretty interesting. If you've got a MIDI controller that enables aftertouch, when you can like push the keys down harder or softer or whatever, this is where you route that to. And we have the pitch bend wheel, and you can set how much of a difference the wheel makes on its extreme sort of values here. So if it's on 5 semitones at the moment. If I play a note and bring it all the way up, it's going to go up 5 semitones. I bring my pitch wheel up, down 5, or I can go 12 semitones now, or do an octave. And so we can actually assign different parameters to the pitch bend other than just pitch, right? So for example, we could route the filter cutoff to the pitch bend wheel as well. So we could go up 5 semitones with the pitch wheel, and then the filter cutoff is also going to move up with it. And we have the mod wheel options. So if you want to route anything to the mod wheel, this is where you do it. Maybe for this example, we'll do FM drive. So if we bring the mod wheel up now, if I bring this amount up to 100%, once I bring the mod wheel up, it's going to start getting like super insane sounding probably. So this is basically our intensity level. So actually when the mod wheel is down the bottom in this example, it's getting really dull, so I'm just going to leave that up the top, and then it's going to be like we originally set it, and we can bring the mod wheel down a bit if it's getting too out of hand. And there's a second routing option for that too. So we can route 2 separate parameters to the mod wheel here. Same with velocity, you can have 2 different parameters on that. And you can also have note dependent time value. So further up the keyboard, maybe the envelopes will get a bit longer, for example. So those are all those options. Now down the bottom here, we also have some extra options. So we have the voices. So if you're doing something similar to what we're doing in this example, and you're using the spread, remember that doubles the voices essentially. So every time you play one note, there's 2 voices. Every time you play 4 notes, there's 8 voices. So maybe for this sound, we want to increase the voices to like 16 or something, so we can play 8 different notes at once without running out of voices. Then we have the retrig option here. So when this is enabled and you play 2 of the same note right after one another, with retrig enabled, it's just going to cut the release of that first note off and then play the next note using the same voice essentially. So you're not doubling up on voices every time you have 2 different release phases overlapping each other. So maybe we'll keep this off for now and increase our voices to 20, so just to be sure we're not running out of voices if we ever play the same note one after another, especially since this is a pad and it has really long release phases. That's probably a good idea. Interpol, it's interpolation. According to Ableton's manual, at least, with the looped noise waveform, it just makes that slightly sort of darker and less harsh sounding, mainly. This anti-aliasing option here, though, is an anti-aliasing filter. So if you're using lots of FM oscillators and you're getting lots of really, really high frequencies, you may start getting some sort of aliasing artifacts or foldback distortion, which usually isn't something that you really want. So if you just turn this on, it tries to sort of get rid of those artifacts a little bit. I do have a video actually on aliasing and foldback distortion on my Patreon, so if you're curious, you can find one there, I guess. But we also have panning, so that's just panning of the whole synth, left or right. So we also have note value dependent panning here, so low notes maybe they're panned all the way left and maybe high notes are panned all the way right. And then we also have random panning, so every time you play a note it's going to randomly pan that note left or right. So that could also be another interesting way to get some stereo width, especially with chords, if you don't want to use the spread option. And save yourself some voices maybe. So if you've made it this far in the tutorial, congratulations, you know pretty much everything there is to know about Operator and how it works. All there is left to do now is actually jump in and actually try to make some of your own sounds. If you do make anything really, really cool, definitely send it my way. The best place to do that is on Discord, and I'll link my Discord server down in the description. For now though, let's chuck a reverb on this pad, because all pads need a little bit of reverb at least, and let's see how this sounds. Wow, that was way more creepier than I thought it was going to sound, but it's actually pretty cool. So yeah, if you like this video and you got something out of it, I would really appreciate a subscription, and there will be a third part to this video when I'm going to dive into a little bit more examples of some actual practical sounds you can make with Operator, like all different types of synth patches and drum sounds, and as many things as I can cover in maybe a half-an-hour video. And also, I do have a Patreon, so thank you very, very much to my amazing Patreon supporters. There are exclusive videos over there, as well as exclusive racks, sample packs, a lot of different stuff. So if you've got a spare $5 a month or something like that, definitely go have a look. But for now, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching.